Shalom, good evening. This is TV7 Israel News broadcast to you from Jerusalem. And in today's top stories, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant commends Israel's security forces for successfully confronting Iranian efforts to flood Judea and Samaria with weaponry and munitions. U.S. Special Envoy Amos Hochstein concludes meetings in both Israel and Lebanon as the Biden administration is eager to end hostilities via diplomatic means. The latest IPC report following a study by the Famine Review Committee rejects claims of famine in the northern Gaza Strip. Israel continues to battle Hamas in the Gaza Strip and Hezbollah in Lebanon, while preparing to confront additional potential threats, including from the northern Samaria region. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant toured the Gilboa and Emek HaMa'ayanot regional councils and conducted comprehensive situational assessments with the respective regional council heads and IDF officials, as communities in the referred to councils have been subject to a rising number of instances of cross-border fire from the area of the Palestinian city of Jenin.
במרחב של הגלבוע, עמק המעיינות, התענכים, כל האזור הזה הוא אזור שבו אנחנו נערכים כנגד כל רע. מצד אחד פועלים בצורה ממוקדת בג'נין, במחנות הפליטים ובכל מקום על מנת לסכל טרור. מצד שני אנחנו מתגברים את כיתות הכוננות, את יחידות ההתערבות שאנחנו מקימים, אנחנו מציידים את כוחות ההתערבות בנשק המתקדם ביותר ובאימון הטוב ביותר, כולל כלי נשק מחלקתיים, רחפנים וכל ציוד שידרש על מנת שהוא יהיה מתחת לידיהם של ראשי המועצות והם יוכלו לפעול במרחב הזה באופן כזה שיבטיח מענה מיידי עד להגעה של הכוחות.
Well, IDF, ISA, and Border Police special operators have conducted extensive, wide-scale intelligence-driven operations dubbed Wavesbreaker that was launched on March 31st of 2024 to essentially counter Iran's increasing influence in Judea and Samaria, with chief focus on the latter's northern sectors. Jerusalem's top defense official commended the ongoing efforts by Israel's security forces to prevent Tehran's belligerent activities. Meanwhile, U.S. Special Envoy Amos Hochstein concluded his visit to Jerusalem last night after a series of meetings with Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, President Yitzhak Herzog, former War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz, and opposition leader Yair Lapid. During the course of these meetings, Hochstein relayed a stern message to Jerusalem's top leaders in which he essentially expressed the Biden administration's determination to end Hezbollah's hostilities against Israel diplomatically, and therefore demands that the IDF restrains its response to the Iranian proxy's attacks. And while Hezbollah essentially launched toward Israel over 5,000 projectiles since October 7th, which is over 1,000 more rockets than what the Iranian proxy launched at Israel during the entirety of the Second Lebanon War, a senior Israeli security official told TV7 on condition of anonymity that Washington essentially threatened Israel that a wide-scale retaliatory response, including versus critical Lebanese infrastructure, to the blatant hostilities against it would alter the Biden administration's policy toward the Jewish state. Meanwhile, after concluding his visit to Jerusalem, Hochstein traveled to Lebanon's capital, where he ensued in talks with Beirut's political elites.
The conversations that I had here today in Beirut and the ones that I had yesterday in Israel, both are being conducted because the situation is serious. We have seen an escalation over the last few weeks, and what President Biden wants to do is to avoid a further escalation to a greater war. That is the effort here. It will take everyone's interest in ending this conflict now, and we believe that there is a pathway diplomatically to do it, if the sides agree to it. But this is a very serious situation that we are in.
President Biden's envoy went on to assert the two diplomatic aspirations which he is trying to pursue as a framework for a cessation of hostilities. The first includes the Biden administration's keen aspirations to end the war in Gaza, which at the moment does not seem plausible since Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar refuses to accept the outline of Israel's proposal. A second option includes far-reaching Israeli concessions related to border territories that have been under dispute since 1948 and which Hochstein hopes to essentially entice Israel to accept a list of far-reaching concessions in exchange for temporary quiet, similar to the maritime delineation agreement that he had helped secure on October 27th of 2022.
A ceasefire in Gaza and/or an alternative diplomatic solution could also bring the conflict across the blue line to an end, creating conditions for displaced Lebanese civilians to go home in the south and for Israeli civilians to go home in their north.
Deliberations on Washington's efforts to reach a diplomatic solution to the conflict is expected to intensify. Israeli Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer and Israeli National Security Advisor Tzachi Hanegbi traveled to Washington today for a series of meetings, including with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, among others. Separately, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant is scheduled to travel to Washington for talks with his American counterpart, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, next week. Meanwhile, at State Department spokesman Matthew Miller reiterated the Biden administration's position, in which it hopes that a ceasefire in Gaza would translate to de-escalation in Lebanon.
Our assessment of the situation continues to be that the best way to get a diplomatic resolution in the north, which we think all sides ultimately prefer, is to reach a ceasefire in Gaza. And so the two are related. Doesn't mean you can't say with 100% certainty that you wouldn't be able to get a ceasefire in the north without resolution in Gaza, but certainly having a ceasefire in Gaza makes a resolution in the north much, much easier.
Miller went on to essentially acknowledge that ongoing negotiations with Islamist Hamas remain deadlocked.
We continue to have conversations with the government of Israel, the governments of Egypt, and the government of Qatar, but I'm not going to get into the status of those conversations or any detail about those conversations from here. We do want to bridge the differences where we can. As you heard the Secretary say and as the President say, there are a number of things that we just think are non-starters and shouldn't have been in the response, go beyond what Hamas demanded previously, and hopefully those are demands that Hamas will back down from because we don't think that they're workable. But there are a number of areas where we think we can find agreement. Doesn't mean we will, because it takes two parties to come to an agreement, but we think it's possible to come to agreement, so we're going to continue to work on that.
Miller further responded to a question on whether the United States would continue to support Israel, that after President Joe Biden threatened Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in a phone conversation on April 4th that unless Israel would expand the quantity of humanitarian aid into Gaza, Washington would reevaluate its own policy vis-a-vis Jerusalem.
So it's because we have seen them take steps that have been productive, not always perfect in every instance, but let me just go through some of them. So we saw after that phone call and after the president made clear that our policy would be dependent on the results, we saw the opening of Zekum, we saw the opening of Erez Crossing, we saw the opening of Ashdod for deliveries to come in, we saw the opening of the Jordan route, so you now have trucks that are coming directly from Jordan, crossing through Israel, in some cases crossing through the West Bank and going directly to the north. It's a significant improvement.
Aid groups say in the north it's gotten just as bad as it was before.
So we have seen, so we don't have people on the ground to make an assessment. We will look to the groups that make assessments to tell us what the actual situation is. But you have seen a significant increase in assistance going into the north. When before that phone call, there wasn't a large amount of assistance that was going in. Everyone knows those stories very well. We have now seen assistance going in. Now look, when we see reports from humanitarian groups, say the IPC that issues reports from time to time, we will take a look at those, and if there are things that need to change, we won't hesitate to be direct with Israel about how they need to make those changes. But we have seen an improvement in the aid situation going in the north, and we've seen somewhat of a stagnation in the south, and that's what we want to see reversed.
It is important to highlight that the latest IPC report, which was sponsored by the United Kingdom, EU, United States, and Canada, and was published last month, The Famine Review Committee essentially rejected assertions by the UN and other aid organizations regarding acute food deficiency in the Gaza Strip. The committee released two conclusions in which it determined unequivocally that an analysis on two accounts of famine in the northern Gaza Strip were not plausible, given the uncertainty and lack of convergence of the supporting evidence employed in the analysis. In other words, data utilized by the analyzing humanitarian bodies were based upon faulty information, which consequently brought about the demonization of Israel by a vigorous campaign of disinformation. Thank you for watching TV7 Israel News. It is important for us to highlight that TV7 Israel is a donation-based non-profit ministry with all of our productions available free of charge. Therefore, we would deeply appreciate it if you'd consider making a donation and help support all of the productions we produce on a daily basis. You can do so by visiting our website at www.tv7israelnews.com. Separately, I'd like to encourage you continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and the salvation of Israel. I'm Jonathan Hessen wishing you an Erev Mevorach, and God willing, we'll see you during our upcoming TV7 Israel updates. Until then, Shalom from Jerusalem.